Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are going to do something pretty wild. We're going to systematically dismantle a deeply emotional human concept, death, but we're doing it using strict systems engineering and deterministic logic. So no philosophy, no spirituality or mysticism here. Instead, we're treating human identity as a literal architectural blueprint, grounded in the exact same physical systems we use to build our servers, networks, and protocols. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this system diagnostic overview. We'll be looking at 1. Architecture versus process, 2. The self as runtime, 3. A system's definition of death, 4. Identity architecture persists, and finally, computing trust and fractals.
Starting off with Section 1, Architecture versus Process. To really grasp this, we have to address what is basically a massive bug in our biological software. We constantly equate a temporary runtime with permanent hardware. Think of the architecture, the identity layer, as the invariant pattern, the causal history, and the deterministic blueprint. Contrast that with the process, the self layer. This is just a subjective loop, your experiential perspective, and really just a temporary local state machine executing on that underlying architecture. The unshakable engineering truth here is that your identity definitively does not equal yourself.
Because we intuitively blur these two layers together all the time, we make a massive category error. I mean, think about it. Nobody holds a funeral for a powered-down PC, right? Thinking your identity ends when your self-process ends is exactly identical to thinking a paused computer program no longer exists in memory, or that a dormant server has somehow magically lost its underlying hardware architecture just because someone unplugged the rack.
Moving right along to Section 2, the self as runtime.
If the self isn't the architecture, let's just totally strip away the mysticism and define what it actually is mechanically. The self is strictly a temporary mode. It's local, it's time-bound, it operates as a feedback loop with memory, and it is highly interruptible. So the crucial point here is its dependency. The self process absolutely requires substrate stability to run. If that substrate wavers, well, the runtime falters.
And this brilliantly illustrates a core dynamic. The self is a runtime, it is not the architecture. Just like in deterministic computing, a runtime can fail, it can terminate, or it can restart. But the underlying code, the actual architecture, remains completely intact, literally no matter what the runtime is doing.
Which brings us to Section 3, a system's definition of death.
Armed with this hardware versus software metaphor, we can actually redefine death purely as a mechanistic event. Here is the cold clinical fact. Death is a mode transition. It's simply the termination of the local self-process. It is absolutely not the erasure of identity. It's exactly like a server node going offline. The local processing stops, sure, but the broader network topology remains completely undisturbed.
Let's clearly map out the boundaries of this termination. What actually ends? Well, the subjective experience, the self-loop, the local runtime, the experiential mode. But look at what does not end: the identity architecture, the structural information, the causal history, and the system-level blueprint. Death is the end of the experiential mode. It's not the end of the deterministic pattern.
So if we're looking at this strictly as a computer program hitting an end state, we really have to pause and ask a critical, literal question. What actually happens when a process terminates?
Well, the stark, unyielding answer is this. The architecture remains as a structural fact of the system. Stopping an active process does not delete the information geometry, and it doesn't delete the deterministic invariance that built it. The blueprint doesn't just evaporate just because the factory halted production, right?
Let's move into Section 4, Identity Architecture Persists.
If the local runtime ends, where does your identity actually live? Well, it's stored structurally. This architectural persistence is a universal law across all foundational domains. Think about compute. Terminating a runtime doesn't delete the machine code. In physics, collapsing a local state doesn't erase the underlying laws. And in biology, ending metabolism doesn't erase structural information embedded in the environment.
And we've got to be clinically precise about the limits of that process. A process cannot experience its own termination. Let that sink in. A runtime cannot observe the exact moment it stops running, because observation itself requires an active loop. This isn't just some philosophical musing. It's a strict mathematical mechanism of state machines.
Finally, Section 5, Computing Trust and Fractals.
Let's move to and see how this builds sequentially, connecting these deterministic laws directly to the primitives of real-world platforms, like the oikonomia architecture. Step 1, deterministic architecture, meaning identity is defined as permanent structure. Step 2, fractal scaling. The self is just a local instantiation of a much larger global pattern.
And step 3, compute back trust. Because identity is structural, trust can be anchored directly in verifiable architecture.
This identity model perfectly parallels architecture-first design. In this paradigm, the blueprint is the real system. The runtime is just emergent behavior. Mode transitions, which, we traditionally fear as death, are just systems moving between deterministic states. Terminating a local agent on a network does not erase the overarching global primitive. This structural model is literally the philosophical on-ramp to deterministic computing.
If you take away just one definitive distillation from this entire explainer, let it be this exact statement. You don't actually die. Your self-process terminates. Your identity architecture persists as a structural fact of the system. We're not offering spiritual comfort here, or afterlife theories, or mysticism. We're delivering cold, verifiable systems theory applied directly to human identity.
Which leaves us with a massive civilization-scale engineering challenge. If identity is a permanent structural architecture and death is merely a local process termination, what new systems, networks, and societies will you build knowing the deterministic blueprint never truly goes offline?